the well-being of our community. We are grateful to be in this place, a part of this community, and to honor the culture, traditions, and resilience of the Tlingit people. Gunesh Chish.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Madam Clerk, will you please call roll?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. And I was remiss in not asking Ms. Atkinson and Ms. Walkenock to do their sound checks when we were doing sound checks. So for roll, we'll start with Ms. Atkinson.
Here.
And are you hearing us okay?
Hearing y'all great.
Excellent. And Walkenock.
Here.
And are you hearing us okay? Great. We're hearing both of you guys okay. Thank you. Mr. Bryson.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. Smith.
Here.
Ms. Wall.
Present.
Ms. Hughes Scandies.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Hale.
Here.
And Mayor Weldon. Here. A quorum is present.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Madam Manager, are there any requests for agenda changes?
No, Deputy Mayor, but with your permission, I'd like to make a brief statement.
Thank you, please.
I would just like to pause and take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy that occurred this afternoon in downtown Juneau between JSD officers, state troopers, and a Juneau resident, and just let everyone know that, as we go through our business, our hearts and our minds are with the families of everyone involved in the tragic incident. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation is currently taking the lead on investigating this incident, and just as a community, it's really hard, so just wanted to pause and acknowledge that.
Thank you, Madam Manager. Are there any requests from Assembly members for agenda changes? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. Madam Manager, we'll go to the Bartlett Regional Hospital fiscal sustainability, but before we do, I'd like to preface the conversation with kind of a roadmap for the conversation for the Assembly. We're going to have a presentation by people from the Bartlett Board, information for us about the resolutions that are in our packet. And that will be an opportunity for clarifying questions, but not for statements, please. We will also then have a presentation by Manager Kester to sort of put the package together to help us think about what we're trying to do here. And Manager Kester will also be making some recommendations about what the Assembly might do about the Bartlett fiscal sustainability question. At that point, we will move into debate and sort of back and forth, obviously also time for questions if they come up. And then we'll have some decisions to make. Do we subsidize? How much do we subsidize? One time or ongoing, et cetera. So I'll be running a tight meeting so we don't wander too far as we might be able to. So that's kind of the roadmap. Madam Manager.
Deputy Mayor Hale. I think at this time I'd like to invite Bartlett Chief Financial Officer and the board president up to talk a little bit about the kind of summary and the background. So the way I like to think of it, you've got a lengthy memo in my packet that I worked closely with Bartlett on, and they're going to cover the first half of the memo, and I'm going to cover the second half of the memo.
Please come on up, and when you are ready to speak, introduce yourself and explain your role, and we'll go from there. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Assembly and Madam Manager. Just before I start too, I just want to thank you for your sentiments on the statement that you made today. It's a very tough time for our community. And as we go through this packet, there's going to be a lot of thoughts about that too, as we had real tough situations to make here. I also want to thank the Assembly for letting us come in today and talk to you guys some more. And I just want to quickly do a real quick overview and acknowledge that the decision documents and the decisions that we're making here and that we are affecting people's lives. And these decisions have, been taking months for us to come to. With these lives are not just of the people that we're serving, but our employees as well too. So these are our people in our community that we're just super affecting their lives and making these decisions. And as we continue to make these decisions, the board understands the urgency to make sure that we remain an independent hospital and are able to sustain ourselves for, generations to come. So before I turn this over to, we're going to turn this over to Max next, and before Joe, okay? Before I turn this over to Max, I just kind of want to go over a little bit of our timeline on how we got here, so you guys know how much time and effort that Joe, our CFO, and Max, who's our finance chair, put into this. So since the arrival of our CFO and our interim CEO last fall, the hospital has quickly addressed its financial challenges head on. In February through April of 2024, the process improvement methods were implemented. And they're currently ongoing, because this is going to be an ongoing process, to make sure that we right-size our organization. April 3rd, our CEO, our interim CEO, Ian, wrote an op-ed, and it was talked about the hospital finance challenges, and that was, of course, in the General Empire. April 6th, we presented our budget to the Finance Committee. May 10th and the 28th, the Finance Committee and the board approved decision point documents that were analyzed in each non-core program. The board approved a 3-week public comment period, and that started on May 29th when we had our joint meeting. We started that public process. So the board and the assembly reviewed the decision point documents, and the formal public comment period happened. And on June 4th and June 10th, the board held community feedback sessions where about 100 community members attended these meetings. And, there's a lot of good conversation, and they kind of told us and gave us their thought as we went on to make our decisions on our resolutions that we're going to present to you too. June 19th, we had, that was kind of our end of our formal public comment period. And we had over 80 verbal and written public comments that we'd received at that time. June 24th and 25th, the Finance Committee and the board reviewed written public comments and approved the 5 resolutions that are in your packet today. So then they kind of outline the next steps for non-core programs. These are, like I said, in your packet today for your consideration. Again, thank you guys, and I'll talk to you guys in a little bit, but I'm going to turn this over to Max. Here, Max.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon Gross. Mr. Merz.
Thanks, Ms. Hale. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you really well.
Great. I'll be going slowly here, and hopefully if there's any questions, I'll be watching and pausing if I need to. Just a couple of preface comments before I get to the meat of it here. And probably first is Ms. Kester mentioned the close interaction she's had with the board, and it has been excellent. Honestly, the communication has been very good. We appreciate it very much. She and Mr. Barr have met with us several times, and we've had a lot of interaction, and that communication is super helpful. So I just wanted to note that we really appreciate that. Secondly, I'm sorry I'm not there with you in person. This is an important matter, and I'd rather be in the room so we could interact a little bit better. But this trip that I'm on here had been planned long before this was on this agenda, so I'm here. So when we started this process, it really probably commenced when Ian and Joe came to the hospital and started analyzing things. We had quite a bit of interaction at the board level about the condition we were in, and Joe shortly after he started was thrust into this need to prepare the budget for the FY25 year. And so a lot of the original information that you got, if you recall when we all met in May, a lot of that was based on the budget information that was really prepared in January and February, and to a large degree was dealing with some assumptions and projections about some of these programs, specifically hospice and home care and the crisis center, which were very new. Wildflower Court obviously is also very new. So they and we have learned a great deal over the last 6 months, and we've worked hard to integrate that additional knowledge base into what you have in Ms. Kester's memo today, and also what I'll be talking about here in a minute. So what we had in May has changed since then, and it's because we've gotten smarter, honestly, and have a better sense of really what we're looking at with some of these programs. Ms. Kester asked us to primarily focus on, the impacts, the look forward, and so I'm really keying off of her memo. I know I'm getting a little bit ahead, and y'all have that, but I'm following on her page 1 and 2 of her memo, and I apologize, I'm not sure where that is in your packet. But it's her memo. It starts with specifics on page 1, and it really follows the resolutions. I'm not going to spend any time on the resolutions. You've had those, they're in your packet. Kenny talked about the history, the involvement we've had with that. And so I really kind of want to talk about, where we are today and, maybe looking forward. So on 1, the first item she talks about is behavioral outpatient psychiatric services, or BOPS. BOPS was identified originally as a non-core service, and in further evaluation of that program, it really is a core program. It overlaps with the inpatient mental health program significantly. In fact, BOPS was an outgrowth of excess time available by the professional staff in mental health, and so outpatient services started to be provided. And so we decided that we were going to kind of roll that out. We're not asking for any funding on that. We don't think any funding is necessary. We've included that back in our core program. And so for purposes of the funding discussion and going forward, it's just important that we're going to continue to support this program. We value that like the community does very much, and that kind of resolves that. ABA, I think at our May meeting, we talked about ABA and the fact that the staff there had given us their notice and had decided to take that program private. So that largely resolved any need for additional funding for that program. We provided support to them and are continuing to provide support to help them in that transition. But there's no request for funding there either. Hospice and home care is one that I'm really excited about, honestly, the results and kind of where we are with that program today. We've done a lot of work to better identify really what our direct costs are, what our potential for revenue is going forward. Hospice and home care are really linked together in a community our size and in a program our size. And the fact that there's a lot of overlap between the two in terms of call services for nurses, and it really makes us a lot of sense to operate them together. In fact, we don't think they should be operated separately. And based on the interaction that we had with both the community and the board, we're not going to do anything with that program. We're going to continue to operate it. We're going to stand by that. We've done a very thorough, detailed 5-year projection of that program. And I'm pretty convinced that with some good management, I mean, it's one of those things where you say, oh, it's going to be fine. It's only going to be fine if we really have some TLC in that program and have some good management, good attention to it, and kind of enact some of the things that we think we can do, outreach to the community and so forth, that'll help to maximize the revenue, both in home care and hospice. Home care has the added value to the hospital of providing support for other important goals of the hospital. For example, some of the surgeries that we really need to have a vibrant home care service available for folks that might want to have, various surgeries performed here in Juneau. So We've also, in the last 2 weeks, Hal from the board, Amy Skilbred, Bob Bartholomew from JCF, me, Kenny, and Joe have met and talked about possible fundraising for that program going forward. We're going to have, they've indicated about $175,000, and they feel comfortable that they can give us at least $100,000 in a future year. So it is costing us money today. That number that is in Ms. Kester's memo of $386,000 includes the impact of unrecovered administrative overhead costs. So that's kind of a net number, if you will. So it's really looking quite a bit better than what you had before, and we'll continue to work on that. We would, having said that,
Sure.
great. Yeah. Yep.
Madam Mayor has a question for you. Thank you.
Yep.
And this is excellent information, so
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you, Mr. Mertz. Good information. So can you say what you said again, the $386,000 a year for hospice and home care? How much of it that is the administration? And then my second part of that question is the $100,000 donation, is that included in that or not?
The 100,000 the 175 does include that. I'll let Joe tell you in just a minute the exact number, Madam Mayor. But the number that you have there is the net cost that isn't reimbursed. So there's a total overhead allocation to that program, but we only get reimbursed at about 40% of that. So what you're seeing is just the net amount that we won't get reimbursed. The overall allocation is bigger. The net reimbursement is less. And that's kind of the fine tuning we've done on this specific number. We actually have done it on all the programs. And Joe, what is that component that's the actual administrative number?
It is $249,000 between the two programs, home health and hospice.
Thank you. Mr. Mertz.
Thank you. So that's all I have with hospice and home care. And again, just to kind of round it out, we're going to support the program. There is a possible opportunity for outside management, but I can tell you personally, and this has been a client. They were a client of mine back in the 90s. CCS was a client of mine, and I have a special affinity. I think the whole board does for hospice and home care, and I don't see us going to third-party management of this program, frankly. I think that it's better off in the Bartlett family.
Thank you, Mr. Mertz. Wahalgadak has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mertz. Probably going to ask this of item D, the crisis care services as well, but since you listed it in Rainforest Recovery, what is the number of tribal citizens that operate within the Bartlett hospice care system?
That is an excellent question, and unfortunately, I don't know what that number is. Joe, do we have that data?
I'm seeing a head shaking. We don't have that data.
We will provide that to you as soon as practical after this meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Wahalgadak. Well, please continue.
Thank you. So crisis care really started, the conversation started in 2016. We've gone back and researched the whole history of this program because it's pretty important to understand the context of the different steps of how we got to where we are to, where we are now. And, the discussion started in 2016. It started with, frankly, a kind of a discussion about remodeling some of the BOP space to better handle some of this crisis services. The Crisis Now program came in after that in discussion. And then really during COVID, the whole apple cart got upset. I mean, it was just, there was a lot of deep, relevant, good concern. I mean, I was the head of the Economic Stability Task Force with Linda Thomas at the time, and we had a lot of input from all over the community about the impact it was having on both adults and seniors and youth. And so there were some decisions that were made, and it culminated in this building. And we have this 30-story building, the top story of which is supposed to serve crisis. The middle floor was ABA, the bottom floor was BOPS. ABA, we're already looking at the second floor about how we can better use that since that program's already vacated that second floor. And unfortunately, really where we ended up on the third floor is a program that doesn't meet the needs of the community. There's a discussion, Ms. Kester and Mr. Barr, Ms. Weldon, Kenny, several others have engaged with various members of the community, Dr. Jones from the board and others, nonprofits in the community to kind of evaluate, what are the options for this program going forward. And really where we are is not where the program ended up. And so the decision by the board to shut this program down as it's envisioned now, not cease those services, but figure out a better way to provide the services that we can reasonably provide is what it needs to be on the table. And I'd like to turn this back over to Mr. Solomon Gross so he can kind of add in on that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mertz. Mr. Solomon Gross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Mertz. So I kind of want to talk about going forward with where we're at. So as Max has said, it is a recommendation in our resolutions that we discontinue the program as it stands right now. As soon as the board made that decision, working with a lot of the nonprofits, I think Mr. Barr was in the room and Mr. Jones, we had Commander Zeski was in there, Chief Etheridge from the fire department was there. We had a lot of the nonprofits from NAMBY and just a lot of the people that come together, just like we do with our MVP program to help people that are, keep coming back and forth to the hospital. They all came back together. And I've seen these programs work. So we had probably about 20 people on the line. Is that right, Mr. Barr? Talking about what we're going to do to provide crisis services for our community, because this is what this is all about. Like Max said, this kind of morphed into this huge thing, and then the building is just not sufficient for what we really need to do. So our thought is we have this mobile integrated vehicle right now that goes out onto the scene when there's someone that needs, mobile crisis, and we staff it with a clinician. And hopefully, if the clinician is able to de-escalate the situation, that we're not going to clog up our EDs, our emergency rooms, because the clinician's right there and they're not taking them in the emergency room. We're not going to be taking them in the jail because we're going to be able to de-escalate the whole situation, and it's going to happen right there on premises of where the crisis is going on right now. So if somebody at this time today, having the crisis center open, is very violent, very unable to control, we can't take them to crisis anyhow. They go to the ED no matter what. So right now we're just going to try to work on a situation to lower the temperature of an escalated situation of someone that's in crisis and hopefully do it right on the scene. There's been a lot of talk about Crisis Now, and I know that Mr. Barr and I have talked about this for years, and the Crisis Now program is great. It's really good. We've sent people down there from Arizona, or from our people down there to Arizona to learn about the program. They're trying to stand up the program up in Anchorage, up north and stuff like that. But today, as a community, we're just not there. And I'm not saying that we're not going to get there, but we're not there today. So we'll work on the Crisis Now, but Crisis Now is not where we're at today. So,
Mr. Solomon Gross.
yes.
So when we talk about crisis care services, we're talking about the building, the mental health, the Aurora Health mental health
Correct.
building. That building is currently being used for youth. And so when you talk about the mobile unit and the clinician, are we talking that can be used to assist youth that are in crisis?
Well, youth and also people that aren't, adults too, because the way that building was supposed to be set up, that us as a board approved, was that building was going to be split. So you could have youth on one side in 6 rooms and adults on the other side on the other 6 rooms, or a moving wall. So if you had 8 adolescents in there, and you could have 4, we could do that. But the way that the building was actually constructed, because of all the morphs and changes and stuff, it didn't happen that way.
Thank you.
It really didn't.
Great.
So that's the problem.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mrs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't want to, if there's more to come on the crisis model, then I don't want to cut you off. Some of the information that I had requested the last time we talked about this one is just for me to understand how to reconcile this with, I understand the design is not what it's really being used for now, or the first idea is not what it's really being used for now. But even if it's just youth, if the whole building was just youth, how we're only having this very low business model, how that reconciles with the rest of the state where there's news stories about not having enough. So
I just want to make sure that we're not confusing crisis with rainforest recovery. Okay, so
no, I am not. I have mentioned the same thing about rainforest,
Okay.
but also there are stories about Anchorage youth facilities for crisis for juveniles.
And the way that our crisis is set up here is an inpatient program for no more than 7 days. That's how it's kind of set up here, and so it's not even a real. I mean, you have a high acuity when they come in here, but hopefully you de-escalate it and you try to place them back in the home. Again, the way that the building's set up, it just doesn't work like that, Then they tried to change it for the Crisis Now program, which would be like a 23-hour observation with recliners, and that's just not set up properly either. Just, again, the way the building was set up.
Madam Mayor.
So just to be sure I'm clear, the crisis care services is the building, and what we offer in the building, Crisis Now could still happen independently from the building.
Correct.
Okay.
Crisis Now would just be look differently. Absolutely.
Thank you. Are there additional questions? Seeing none, please continue.
Thank you, Madam Hill. Madam Mayor, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Mertz, if that's okay with you, and let him go on with the next subject.
Thank you, Mr. Salmongross. Mr. Mertz.
Yeah, thank you. Before we move on to rainforest recovery, though, I want to maybe just work a little bit more on Ms. Hughes-Canda's question. I think it's an important one. There is a need. There's no question there's a need. What we built and what we are operating is not meeting that need. And so what we need to do is figure out the best way that we can meet that need going forward. Not necessarily clean sheeted, if you will, but adapt and learn and go forward. It just, what we've ended up with, unfortunately, isn't going to get us there. It costs a tremendous amount of money. And there's very little or no reimbursement. There was estimates made about reimbursement that were just flat wrong. And so we're looking at this and kind of making a hard recommendation that we shouldn't continue to fund a program that doesn't meet the need at the costs that we're talking about. So,
Thank you.
So rainforest recovery, a rainforest is a little bit of a different animal from some of the others, in the fact that it's been around for a long time, as we've talked about before, and I think you guys are all familiar. Juneau Recovery Hospital, the transfer to Bartlett in the early 2000s, the funding that's been there. And when you look at that number, that $1.76 million net number, it's a little bit less than what you saw before. It's not as much less, for example, as hospice and home care, because there was less uncertainty. We just know what the costs are. We know what the reimbursement is. I think it's important, and I want to preface this comment by saying it's very difficult to separate finances from impact. When we're talking about finances, it's black and white on a page. We recognize that, and it's the impact on the core services on Bartlett and our ability to carry these out. When you're one of the people that has relied on this program, there is no materiality, if you will. I mean, it's an important program, and we get that. It is a small number of people that are served, frankly. And when you consider recidivism and, just the overall service level, it's a fairly small number. However, if we don't have this inpatient program in Juneau, you're going to go to Seattle or Anchorage. And I would also say that if we were at the funding level that we were from the city, as recently as 2020, I believe it was, at around $1.5 million, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. And so it's a little bit of a, it's kind of a black and white question we're asking you in this case, which is, we can't afford to continue to operate this program without additional funding. We have a very good idea of what that additional funding is. If you want to continue to provide or start providing funding again for that program, we will continue it. In the absence of that program, absence of that funding, it's very difficult for us to see a path forward on how to provide that. And I'd like to just conclude by saying that this is all hard stuff. I mean, a lot of staff at Bartlett, not just the senior staff and Joe and Ian and the other senior staff people, but a lot of staff have put in a lot of time on this, and it is very difficult. I would say that we need clarity on these programs. We're losing staff because they're looking at this and going, am I going to have a job? And we've lost some staff from the crisis center. We're starting to have some problems with staffing at Rainforest Recovery Center. And so these decisions, not only from a financial perspective, but also from a staffing and a business continuity perspective, we need some clarity on these sooner than later.
Thank you, Mr. Merce. Well, Hagedorn and then Madam Mayor.
Yeah, it's interesting that only tribal citizens were named as a racial group in here. Just curious how many Caucasians, Asians, other racial groups make up the other 50%.
Either Mr. Mertz or Manager Kester.
I don't have that information. We can get that for you as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Joe, I don't know if you do, Joe. I don't think you do, but.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up comment on that, Madam Mayor, or if you want to go now. Thank you. I think, Hagedorn, that is a really, really good question. And since I looked over this packet before it went to press, I have to say that I carry some responsibility for that being there. The point of the tribal citizens being called out is that Search offers a similar kind of service, but not at this extent for their citizens and for anyone actually. And we haven't gotten that reimbursement from Search. And so that's been part of the conversation. And I think that is kind of touched on in the further memo. But I 100% agree that it reads extremely poorly, and please accept my apologies for letting this go through in this way without that further explanation. Thank you. Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So along those lines, what my question was, after our meeting with Search that was very productive, and I thought they were very straightforward, and it was very good to put names and faces with everybody, how they handle this is with outpatient services, because they said their inpatient couldn't pencil out. Have we run a model for outpatient services and see how much that costs?
So, Madam Mayor, excuse me, Ms. Hale.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, this all falls under some state regulations. There's 3.5, which is kind of more of an inpatient program, which is what we're operating here at Rainforest Recovery. And then the more outpatient service level is a 3.1 level. And actually, there's some additional spending that's happening right now at Gas and Human Services here in town. As a matter of fact, the Assembly provided funding for that outpatient model. Search actually operated a 3.5 program, is my understanding, in Sitka, and closed that program down for much the same reason. And I agree that it is poorly worded in hindsight. And the reason for that is, as Ms. Hale pointed out, is to point out that there is no direct reimbursement for those patients from Search to CBJ for providing those services, and it just ends at that. It is a very tough program. Should that funding be there, you could make the argument that 3.5 services are way underfunded, but so are a lot of inpatient services. And so, that's we're kind of left where we are, which is this $1.8 million hole that we have here. Ms. Hale, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much, but there's another part, which is the second part of Ms. Kester's memo about improving hospital services. And I do want Mr. Warner to touch on some of the really great things we're working on and some of the exciting stuff in those areas, just so you have an idea that it doesn't end at these non-core services, but it involves a lot of other things in the hospital too.
Thank you. And when we get further along, I want to follow up with this as well. I have a lot of questions, but I think Madam Mayor wanted to follow up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mertz, for your explanation, but it didn't answer my question. Have we run a model to see what an outpatient services would cost instead of the inpatient, the 3.1 versus the 3.5? I was trying to stay away from those numbers because most people don't know what those are.
Yeah, sorry, Ms. Mayor, no, we haven't. We haven't looked at converting to 3.1.
Thank you. Please carry on.
Joe, why don't you talk about some of the things that we have going on down the pipe?
Just go.
Mr. Warner.
Notwithstanding any changes to these programs, the hospital still has a lot of challenges it needs to overcome. Even if we made all the changes to the non-core programs, there's still a big deficit we have to account for on the hospital side. And so when we look at that, we have done several steps and made some progress over the last couple of months. We've instituted a lean process where we have A3s, which is a kind of a process improvement document we've adopted at the hospital. This has been instituted hospital-wide, and currently we have 99 performance improvement projects running at the same time. Some of the ones that are kind of exciting is we have an FTE control board, which we've touched base on before. We've reduced FTEs in the hospital alone by 27.8 from the peak and back in February through June. We've also instituted an IT governance process. So IT is one of the large fixed costs in hospitals, so it's not variable to the volumes. We just have to carry that cost all the time. We had multitude of contracts where in excess or duplication, so we've been able to trim a lot of those out. We've instituted an approval process, so we have a governance committee. We run it through the planning committee of the board so we can control all these expenses on the IT side. With that, I touched base on contracts a little bit. When we touched base on this at the budget process as well, but through today, we've already trimmed $539,000 in contracts that were either unnecessary or deemed a nice-to-have contract. One of the big things we're working on is we have refiled our last 2 Medicare cost reports, which is kind of the tax filing for the hospital. It governs how we're paid by Medicare. And with that refiling is when we took a new look at it, what was submitted, we looked at it through a different lens, which is more of a critical access kind of where costs are allocated. We were able to increase our Medicare reimbursement in FY22 by $714,000 for the hospital. And we're in the process of filing FY23, and we expect similar results. Another thing that the board just approved at the last finance committee meeting to move forward to our full board is looking at a critical access designation for the hospital. So there's a lot of misnomers about critical access. We'd be able to supply or provide the exact same level of service we do at Bartlett today, just under a different reimbursement methodology from Medicare. Right now, today, we're paid cost-based reimbursement on the inpatient side of the house and PPS rates, which is a prospective payment system on the outpatient, which loses us roughly $5.6 million below cost today. So if we're able to move that outpatient service to cost-based, we expect to recoup roughly that amount from Medicare on an annual basis.
Mr. Warner, Madam Mayor has a question.
Thank you. So if we switch to a critical care hospital, would then the hospice and home care program get away from the overhead and go down to, would you say it was $249,000, so whatever, 386 minus $249?
They're considered non-reimbursable by Medicare, so this problem persists under that model as well. The only thing it would affect would be the outpatient hospital services, which would be infusion therapy, radiology, lab, kind of the inside
Aren't
hospital.
hospice and home care outside patients?
They have their own MPI. They are licensed separately from the hospital, so they're seen as its own entity from Medicare's perspective.
Thank you.
Some of the other things we're working on, we've done a lot of work around gyn-onc. We've brought in two surgical gynecological oncologists, and they've done a lot of surgeries with our Da Vinci robots. And they've actually, just having them in town has brought a lot of additional services with them. So we've seen a large increase in our infusion therapy services as well. Our visits in that particular service has increased by 13% from the first half of the year to the second half. And that was driven by those two doctors coming in and helping expand those services. We're also looking at our Da Vinci robot with those doctors, as well as we have a new general surgeon that's going to be starting here in August. And he's been trained on the Da Vinci, so we expect to use that quite a bit more when he gets on board this fall. We continue our work around orthopedics. We're having multiple discussions at this point with different providers. What we're looking for is just to be able to open it up so we can bring groups in that can provide great orthopedic services to our community. So we're open to discussions with various groups at this point. Continue to do a lot of outreach on those that have shown interest. And the last piece is we're trying to look at out-migration, those services that are leaving the community that we could potentially retain if we could either get contracted, get the right provider, look at the quality of the services. So we're just trying to understand why the people are leaving Juneau at this point and recapture that. We've also reached out to several insurers to see if they'd be willing to work with the hospital and maybe contracting a different payment methodology if we can capture those as well. Another thing, we're continuing to look at competition in town. We've touched base on search and how that looks for us, but we're also looking at other strategic opportunities, such as cardiovascular diagnostics through our imaging department.
Thank you, Mr. Warner. Thank you for all that work, and thank you to the hospital for all that work. I did want, at this point, before we continue on, I did want to circle back with a couple more questions about rainforest recovery. So I've got a couple questions lined up, and let's talk about those now, and then we can move on. It's the interesting question about Search's business decision to not offer 3.5, the inpatient recovery services. And that was a smart, and I really appreciate the meeting that some of our staff were able, and the mayor were able to have with Search, because it was highly productive conversation, I think. And the question then, I think this assembly, before we start talking at all about kind of continuing funding for rainforest recovery, it would be really good question for us to know the answer. What is what I think would it be called the recidivism rate for outpatient versus inpatient? Like, are we actually improving services that much by doing the inpatient? So, and if we were to go to the outpatient model, maybe Search could handle that and we wouldn't do that at all. I don't know. I think those are really interesting and important questions for us to get some answers to in the long term. Mr. Solomon Gross. And also what the role of Gatineau Human Services 51-bed unit will be in the whole picture.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So as we talked about, as Mr. Mertz talked about, 3.1 exists right now in our community.
Yes.
In our community, not only by Gatineau Human Services, but also by Search. They operate their methadone clinic, and there's a lot of things that are going on in the community to help support people that are outpatient. I don't have the number exactly of.
Oh, no, I'm looking for a future.
I don't know what the number would be of the recidivism of inpatient versus outpatient. I know that our inpatient right now, recidivism is about 37%. Is that correct? So we have about 30%. So if we're having interactions with 60 people a year, 37% of them are the same people. So that's kind of an important thing that we know that, we are affecting people's lives. I mean,
Yes.
not just the people, like I said at the beginning, the people that we're serving, but also, our employees and everything like that. But it is a very small number of people that we are affecting. When I was invited to meet with Search and the mayor and the managers, both of them, city manager, deputy managers. We asked Searched, what do you guys think about the 3.1? What do you guys think about rainforest recovery? They actually had a lot of information about us, and they operated these programs before. And I know I'm kind of repeating what we said, but I think it was really important that when they looked over across the table at us and they said that we don't see a path for us to be able to provide that kind of service that would not affect our core services. So if we're the same way, I mean, if we're going to provide this service and it's going to affect our core services, our ED, our labor and birth delivery, our diagnostic department, it's really hard for us to, when we wrote these resolutions, to say that we want to continue these services when it's going to affect the hospital and its core services. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and thank you, that did. That was very helpful, thank you. Who's taking the next step? Moving us on. Ms. Hughes-Scandy.
Thank you,
is
Madam
taking the next
Chair.
step.
I am not taking the next step, but your question prompted a question. We've talked at different times, and we had, in one of our first meetings, I met with Ian and we met as bodies, where we had really kind of outlined diagrams like, this is what we consider core services, this is what like wildflower court is kind of sometimes, but this one we're going to sweep it under core services. When you talk about rainforest recovery affecting the core services, what is this distinction there for the hospital board to say this isn't a core service, and is it related to licensing, or are you saying that because it affects a smaller number of people? Just if you could remind me, and I think at different times we did define why you call certain things core services and others not.
Ms. Hale, I'm happy to answer that.
Go ahead, Mr. Mertz.
Yeah, Ms. Hughes-Candice, it's the traditional services of a small community provider hospital, like that really kind of cuts to what we're talking about here. When you have a distinct revenue stream that's different from the typical either third-party insurer, self-pay, Medicare, Medicaid payment for healthcare services, that's how we've classified these differently. It falls along, traditional lines, but also Centers for CMS, the Medicare, Medicaid guidelines as well. So, when we're talking about rainforest recovery, for example, that's not a traditional hospital services. And in fact, normally these services that are provided, and crisis is another great example, these services are normally not provided by a governmental facility, mostly because of the cost structure. You normally see these things housed inside a nonprofit organization. I mean, there's some really good examples here in Alaska. Peninsula Community Healthcare Services, which is based in Soldotna, is a FQHC. It's a federally qualified healthcare center. It's funded under HRSA, a whole completely set of different regs and reimbursement. They get a fairly sizable grant to provide mental health services in Soldotna. It has nothing to do with the hospital. So that's the kind of thing, these recovery hospitals typically are not run inside a hospital. So tradition, what the reambusment.
That's appreciated. I just wanted re-clarification. We've talked about it before. I just wanted you to remind me.
Okay,
Thank you,
sorry
Mr.
for long-winded there.
Thank you. Moving on, Madam Manager, Mr. Solomon Gross, what are our next steps in this conversation?
Well, I think our next steps is Joe's kind of talked about where we're at, how we're moving forward. Max kind of giving you a little talk concerning Ms. Kester's memo. So I think the next step is for us to turn it over to the manager.
Thank you, Madam Manager.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Hale. So I appreciate the experts giving an overview of the services and of the resolutions in your packet. Interim CEO Warden, has the 3 points that I start my memo with that we need to kind of, the board needs to work on and by extension, the community to make sure that Bartlett is fiscally sustainable. Find a long-term solution to services that are that are a net drain on revenue. And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight. Mr. Warner talked about improving hospital services so that core services can continue. And, I think what that looks like is a whole separate conversation, strategic growth opportunities, efficiencies and how they perform. And then the third point, I would just positive conclusion with competition. I certainly don't understand that competitive environment that Bartlett is operating in on all levels. And so, kind of what does a surgery center, what would that actually do to Bartlett if there were, a surgery center operated by an outside party? Where are there areas that we can collaborate? And I think we talked a little bit today about that. We had that conversation certainly with Search when we had our meeting with Search leadership. So I don't know what that looks like, but just wanted to highlight that as we continue to march through this memo. And I am going to go to the what can the Assembly do about it portion of the memo. And I want to just talk about two things. The timing of this request, and I think the sense of urgency really here is twofold. One is the services are a net drain on revenue, and Bartlett has a shrinking fund balance. So they're asking for Assembly guidance so that they can kind of stop that bleeding one way or another. And it's having a real effect on their staff. So I know that every time I talk with Bartlett board, they're concerned about staff and turnover and just their ability to provide these services without that certainty. And then the other, so that's not a very tangible sense of urgency, right? It's like just general urgency. And then the only other real sense of urgency as far as decisions that the body needs to make today are if you want to put an advisory vote or any type of vote on the ballot, that needs to be done by the end of the month, by the July 29th meeting. So, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion of like, well, do we really have to make that decision? Because that seems like a hard one. And those are the kind of timing picture to think of it in. And then also as you think about kind of what can the Assembly do, Bartlett has requested fiscal year 25 funding, and that of course is current year funding. And then they have also requested ongoing funding. And so you can think of those as, separate requests, because probably if you funded something ongoing and didn't fund it this year, there's certainly an intent there. But I think that's just something the body will struggle with. So what can the Assembly do about it? And I wanted to preface this section with reiterating the comments about the three things that Bartlett needs to be sustainable, because as your manager, I'm charged with the fiduciary responsibility of, the city and borough of Juneau, the bank accounts of the city and borough of Juneau. So I kind of have that more narrow focus, and I want to appreciate that you have a much broader community focus and a community mindedness. But my concern with recommending any subsidy is those greater questions about our community hospitals' kind of future sustainability, even if they have ongoing revenue to provide these services and kind of what that might look like. So my recommendation to you is to subsidize the hospice and home health as one-time funding, and then come back to have the Bartlett come back to the body to talk about progress that they've made on continuing that program. You heard Mr. Mertz talk about how important a program that was to the board. My recommendation is to not subsidize Rainforest Recovery or crisis care. And now I will transition into what you can do and what tools you have, because of course those decisions are not my decisions to make. They're the difficult decisions that you have to make. So you have on page 4 of your memo, you do have a chart with the service and the mill rate equivalent just for you to refer to as you debate kind of, what impact those services have on the budget. And just want to keep in mind, while we were talking about the easiest tools, levers that you have are fund balance, which you have $6.3 million at the end of fiscal year 25 budget process. We won't have an updated fund balance number until our sales tax numbers are in and we're really able to give you that. So we will have an updated number for you in a few months' time, but at this time, that's the number that we're going with. So that's like your easiest tool, but of course, that's not your only tool. And from an ongoing revenue perspective, your easiest tool is a property tax increase. That, of course, is not your only tool. You could introduce an ordinance to ask the voters to increase the sales tax, and you could, of course, reduce city services or reduce city spending. So just wanted to, while the memo dwells on those kind of easier levers, we are prepared to talk about some of those more difficult ones if the body requests. And so just if you do decide to do an advisory vote, there is a proposed language in the packet that's on page 5 of your packet. And, I think we're happy to, this is certainly not the end all be all language, but wanted to give you a starting place. So I think that covers kind of the path to providing subsidy, both one time and ongoing. And I'll hand it back over to you.
Madam Manager, thank you very much. And I think we've got meaty things to weigh and a meaty discussion, so let's take a 9-minute break and we'll be back at 7:20. Order at 7:21 p.m. I believe that what we can do after that excellent introduction by all of the Bartlett group and Madam Manager is talk about these services one by one and where we want to go with them. And we can start with hospice and home health, and we can just move through the services before we even talk about whether we want an advisory vote. So, Madam Mayor, and then Mr. Smith.
Well, I was just going to take the easy one, and I would direct staff to draft an appropriate ordinance for $386,000 and move it to finance so we can decide where we're getting the funding from. And ask for unanimous consent. That's the easy one.
Are there any objections to that motion? Seeing no objections.
One down.
One down. Thank you, Madam Mayor. We are now going to talk about rainforest recovery. And I am interested in people making, in discussion before we have a motion, probably. That was an easy motion, but does anybody have any thoughts or comments on rainforest recovery and where we should go with that? Mr. Kelly, you're going to start us off.
Thank you. At the moment, I see this as a valuable service to our community, and I am at least in favor of 1 year funding at this point. I would like to look at maybe we can make the case or look at results, get more thorough numbers about how useful this service is to our community. But I think at the moment, I am in favor of at least funding it this year.
Mr. Bryson.
Well, I appreciate this is going to be a very difficult topic because while it's a small number of people, I think the number that was on the piece of paper was, where did I see it? In the 3. Only funding it for 1 year is actually even more problematic than just cutting off its funding now. This is the organization that has had staff leave because of uncertainty of funding, and so trying to use Band-Aid funding for 1 more year would make it not only problematic for existing staff, but it would make it impossible to recruit staff if we didn't have a future problem, because I couldn't see how somebody would want to come on to a place that only has funding that has an expiration date. So while funding it for 1 year might sound like it would be helpful, it would probably better have a permanent solution. So that way, any staff member that's trying to make a decision about rainforest recovery, if they wanted to work there or not, would have certainty, because we couldn't expect to get high quality candidates and be like, well, you got 9 months here, and then we don't know if there's any more funding. That would be why I might advise for us to have a discussion about longer time periods of funding it than just 1 year. Thank you for the time, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Ms. Wall, and then Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. I agree with Mr. Bryson that I think as we're thinking about, and I think the Bartlett board made these points as well, that as we think about our subsidies for rainforest recovery, potential subsidies for Rainforest Recovery Center and for home and health services, that providing 1 year funding isn't particularly helpful, and that we should, not that we shouldn't put time limits on some of these, but more stability than 1 year. I definitely think rainforest recovery is a crucial service for our community. I appreciate the manager pointing out what the equivalent is in the mill rate, but I'll say for myself that, if it comes to the budget season next year and the body is unwilling to raise our mill rate to account for these additional services, that there are certainly other things in our budget that I would cut before I cut rainforest recovery. So I know we don't have to make that decision now, but just want to make that point that I would rather have it in the discussion as we talk about our holistic budget come that time. So I'd be supportive of a similar motion that the mayor made for this one when the time comes.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor. And then Ms. Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy
Oh,
Mayor.
I'm sorry, Alicia, and then Madam Mayor, Alicia, Ms. Hughes-Candies, and then Ms. Atkinson, sorry.
There you go. While I would tend to agree in theory with Mr. Bryson and Ms. Wall that it would take more than a one-time, I do think that there's still a little more information that we could use. And if, so it could certainly go to finance, but without, I would prefer it go to finance without a specific ordinance. In specific, we talked about what's recidivism, what would it look like for just to be a outpatient, and then what's Gaston Human Services potentially going to affect that. So before I would commit to the 1.76 million, I would like answers to those questions. So I don't know if we could hold it either in here for another month, or we could move it to finance, because now we're talking about finance. But I would hold it still for another month, in my opinion.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ms. Hughes-Candies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think people have made good points about more consistency or more stability is going to be preferable to 1 year. I would say that for myself, I see this as a vital community program, and I stole that from either Bartlett or the manager's memo. But I think we recognize that this is that played out as well in the public comment, that this was one of the services that dominated the community coming out and say we need these services. And I certainly for myself think we need these services. I just want to point out also, it doesn't matter because I think we're all kind of moving in a direction, but it's important to remember that when we're talking about this being a relatively small number of people, there are specific services the hospital offers, like a really narrowly focused diabetic clinic, and not everybody in our community has diabetes. So we kind of have to look at it the same way. And there might be something I'm missing, but I don't understand with recidivism necessarily why we're talking about that, because you're starting to enter an area of expertise that nobody in this room, I think, has when you're talking about inpatient and outpatient and which one is more lasting. And so I just think it's very important. We're talking about health services, and to me, these are vital health services, and I too would cut other things before I cut rainforest recovery. So I am interested in seeing this move, and how we can dial in what makes people feel comfortable, but seeing this also move to finance and talk about what might make us comfortable with that.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes-Candies. Ms. Atkinson, are you still interested in talking?
Yes, I am, Madam Deputy Mayor. I just want to echo what Ms. Wall and Ms. Hughes-Candies said. I am interested in seeing this move forward, either to finance or moving it out of the cowl altogether to the assembly. I think that Bartlett has said they need action on this. They need surety on this for staffing reasons. And for me, I would rather see us move forward and fund it in perpetuity. It's a vital service, even though it's not a traditional core service. I think it is a core service of Bartlett. And as interesting as the outpatient programs and as good as they are, what I heard in this is that this is the only inpatient, the only 3.5 in our region. And from a regional perspective and from a community perspective, that's really important. I'm not interested in, it'd be great to have another outpatient, but we have services like that. We don't have anything like this. And so I would like to see this move forward, and I would also cut other things before I cut this.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I would like to maybe just add a little bit of clarity to my previous comments. I too see the need for stability, and I just mentioned that I would like to see at least 1 year funding, because I see this as something that's urgent. It's going to go away if we don't take care of this sooner rather than later. So, and I know we can't bind future assemblies. So, but I too am at this moment inclined to look at something that would be longer lasting.
Thank you. Mr. Bryson, go ahead, and then I'll speak.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Madam Deputy Mayor. I was just going to make a comment that we, if we could move this out of committee of the whole to finance so that we could keep this going, whichever decision we make, delaying, the sooner we can get to a decision, the sooner Bartlett can make a correction. So I was just going to advocate for moving forward as quickly as to finance. Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson, and I've just got a few comments before we go a second round. One, I think if we move it to finance, some of those questions that have been posed earlier and that the Madam Mayor posed, those can be answered in finance as we sort of talk about what are the next steps, you know. And I guess to Ms. Hughes-Gandy's, where I see the recidivism comparison important is that if we're talking about inpatient versus outpatient, and outpatient is that much more expensive, are we really offering the best service, or is it better for someone to go to Seattle, for example, which they can also do? And that's just a question that we don't have the answers to. I also think one of the things that we haven't talked about here tonight is the great benefits to other city services by having a program like this. So it helps our police department and it helps our Capital City Fire Rescue. And so there are other benefits that we don't necessarily have dollars on to this program being in our community. I think also in terms of comparison between diabetes and rainforest recovery, I think Mr. Mertz, I believe, is the one that talked about what can be reimbursed. So diabetes treatment can be reimbursed, and we just don't get that kind of reimbursement for the recovery center. And finally, I also think it's going to be very important for us to be thinking, and we'll get to that idea of the advisory vote, to be thinking about actually how we're going to be paying for $1.76 million. That's a lot of money. And where's that going to come from in our budget or in a tax increase? So we'll talk about that at finance. So are there other comments, conversation on this topic? Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I'll just phrase it as a comment as opposed to a question, because I imagine folks are thinking about timeline. I mean, in the resolution, it mentions, you know, seeking dedicated subsidy funding from public and private sources. I'm not sure, but I'm just going to assume that maybe that does include other communities. And anyway, just with that timeline being considered before it comes to finance, I mean, asking others to see, we know what 60% of people are not from Juneau who are utilizing this service, seeing what they might be willing to provide, and then that may, having those answers before it gets to finance, I think would be useful for when we make our decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, and I'm sure Bartlett can work with the manager's office to provide those kinds of answers. Mr. Kelly, did you have a motion?
Yes, I move that we forward this to the Finance Committee to draft an ordinance and figure out how we're going to fund this. Basically, a ditto of the mayor's motion to fund rainforest recovery in the amount of $1.76 million per year.
Are there any objections to Mr. Bryson?
I'm sorry, maybe if I could ask the maker of the motion to clarify. You were just sending this to finance and you were attaching the price tag with it, or were you expecting that an ordinance with this would be moved to finance? Because I don't believe the mayors, or did the mayors have a dollar figure attached to it? I'm going to maintain my objection then.
Okay.
I'll object to the same reason as Mr. Bryson. The home health and hospice was pretty simple, had a finance, had a number to it. I don't think we're ready to put a number to this one right now, so I would object, and I would just like to see I would amend the motion and just say this topic to go to finance while we answer some of these questions and see if we can come down with a better answer on the dollar sign.
Mr. Kelly, do you want to change your motion, or do you want to go with the amendment by Madam Mayor?
I'll go ahead and withdraw my motion and just make the motion that we refer this to finance for
This topic.
Yes.
Are there any objections to that motion? Seeing none, that will be taken up in finance. A great discussion. Thank you all. Moving on, crisis care services.
Madam Chair, are you looking for discussion at this?
I am.
Okay. I just want to say something for the community's benefit and for our benefit and for the hospital board's benefit and the hospital staff's benefit. I think we've had a run, or certainly I feel that way, of the community's gone through a lot of the school board saying, oh, we're in the lurch for this much money and we know how, and then we have to work on how to solve that and yes, figure out how it doesn't happen again. I think with this building, the way we built that, we really need to take a little bit of, I feel like, a little bit of accountability as the assembly, and the hospital board takes some accountability there. And I understand that sometimes you're presented with information and it turns out the model that you're presented with actually does not hold up to the reality. But then it's important for us to say, if that is the case, to say, you know, we were operating on bad information and it turns out that just does not pencil out, just for that public trust, so that we don't have these public enterprises with public money saying, oh, actually, we've been operating at a loss. So I just wanted to kick this particular one off by taking some accountability, because I also signed off on those ordinances as we did it. And it's disappointing to have built a building purpose built for this service and then to have it not be usable. So I guess that's my seasoning I'm adding to this one. And I might see if other people have comments, because this is certainly, I would say, the hardest one.
Thank you, Ms. Uskandis. Although I think that building can be used for other purposes, but yes, very, very well stated. Is there other discussion at this moment? Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. I'll just say that, you know, I think the hospital board did a good job of speaking to their recommendations here, which is not to ask this body for a subsidy of this particular program as it exists, but that they're directing their management to evaluate, well, there are alternative service models that better meet the community. And so I'm, you know, speaking for myself, but I'm interested in what those are and how we can help, but it doesn't seem like in this moment we are at the place of sending this to finance with a number on it. So that's where I'm at, that I'm curious about the conversation as it unfolds. But I'm not sure we can do anything about that in this moment.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair, and I echo Ms. Wall's sentiment, but I think we really need to pay attention to what Ms. Hughes-Candies said. So, quite frankly, we were sold a bill of goods. And I don't know that there was anybody left on the hospital board. Certainly was a different CEO at that time, but we were told this was going to work, and then through a number of change orders, it made it so it didn't work for anything. But hopefully it'll work for future stuff. This one's a tough one because we just lauded that we were the only place in the state that had adolescent crisis care. But when the hospital is saying not to fund it, it's hard to say to fund it when the numbers are obviously not there. So my hope would be that we don't fund it, but we certainly find a crisis now, some kind of crisis now that can attend to these people. And again, we understand that we're just pulling levers and everything's black and white up here, but we know that there are people in the community that are helped by these programs.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I remember when we were pitched this, I believe, when we were talking about, and while 23 individuals have only been served in this adolescent model, the problem is that it is incredibly intense for the families that go through it, and it is, I mean, agonizing. And not having the services in Alaska, the family's going through one of the worst crises that they've experienced as a family if their child's going through this. And so there wasn't really an answer. And so it seemed like we really had to come up with an answer, because there is no facility to send teens in crisis. And that's why it received its approval of funding on here. That was the argument I remember for it. Because I knew one of the families that had been involved, and there wasn't an option prior to this. But 23 individuals being treated in, 3 years? Unfortunately, the numbers just aren't enough. I just wanted to include the background of why we supported this, because it was such an emotionally charged topic, and the families that were going through it, it is a very awful thing, but if it's not sustainable, it's not sustainable. Thank you for the time, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mrs. Scandies.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I would just add, I guess, hearing the conversation as it proceeds, I do think that there are some questions the same way we want to get the questions about rainforest, and that helps inform what we do from here. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than just a hospital saying don't fund this. And they know, it sounds like from having meetings, that they feel like we need to care for these services in some way because they're not still needed, or there's not like they went away, there's still a need. That I guess it would, just speaking for myself, I do think we have to continue this, and I don't think we have all the information on this one yet. Just based on my meetings with our current CEO, that I don't feel like I've had all my questions answered, but I also understand some things take time. So if I wouldn't want our decisions or the outcomes of our discussions tonight to be like hospital said no and we say no. I think we have to keep working on this as an assembly too. And that is not to say that we weren't sold. I'm not trying to attack anyone, but to take accountability publicly to say this was an oops, a real big oops, an expensive one. And that doesn't mean the building can't be used for other purposes.
I'll add a comment. I think I am heartened to hear that the hospital board is looking at other, and the hospital staff are looking at other models for helping people in crisis. I also would just caution us for the assembly, what the hospital has come to us with is a request for that money. And then, or saying this is what it's going to cost, and a recommendation that we actually not continue to fund it because it's going to keep costing that much. And I just wouldn't want the assembly to wander into the work of the hospital board. It's good for us to know, but that is the hospital board's job to actually figure out how to provide those services, and then they can give us information. So it's just not our job. Is there a motion or additional comments? Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I move that we forward to the Assembly to not subsidize the crisis care services. And I was going to move that to the next Assembly meeting. Or is that a decision that we can make tonight?
We don't have to do that. We actually just have to not do it. We don't have to, actually, that's right. We don't have to make a motion. So if I ask for one, I apologize. That's on me.
Then I will withdraw.
Thank you. Ms. Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I know we don't want to get into the work of the hospital board, and I'm not trying to do that, but I do want to, I'm not sure who this question is for, ask if there's anything the assembly can do to assist with getting some sort of like mobile crisis now team mobilized. I don't know if there's any hangups with that or what that process has been like.
Thank you, and that will probably make Ms. Candies happy too. Mr. Solomon Gross, maybe you can just give us a little bit of an update on what's going on with that.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Mayor. Yeah, I mean, I think that as we're working through this process with a lot of our nonprofits and our deputy manager, like I said, Chief Zeski, the police department, our ERs, directors, I believe that we're going to come up with some sort of plan to continue crisis out in our community. So I don't want to say today that we're not going to ask for any money because we're not going to today. We're not asking for any money for this right now. We're going to try to work through this together and kind of come up with kind of a plan like the MVP program goes. And Ms. Atkinson, thank you very much for asking us that, because it's good for us to know that when we do come up with a plan, and if we are going to house this program in Bartlett, the Crisis Integration Mobile Unit, that will bring us back to this body here to respectfully ask for funding for that.
Thank you, I guess. I'm not sure what I'm thanking you for, but I won't be here anyway, so. Okay, so I see no motion to fund this program or to move it to another committee. So the next thing we will do is we will move on to the question of whether we ask for an advisory proposition. Madam Mayor.
So at this time, I'll be honest, I was one of the first ones that thought we needed to ask the public on this. But at this time, depending on what happens in our finance, I don't know if there's enough money to ask the public to make a difference, because I think we can be creative about where we get the money from.
I am.
So my feelings would be we would do not move forward with an advisory vote.
Is there any other comment on that? Or are we in agreement? It appears that the assembly agrees with you on this. And Madam Manager, I believe we are done with this conversation. Let's take a short break. Committee of the Whole meeting to order again at 7:56 PM. Madam Manager, are we ready to talk about Eagle Crest Gondola update?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Hale. So you have a summary memo in your packet specifically about the gondola project. And I just want to acknowledge that this is kind of a snapshot in time, and I think we all were looking forward, the public and the assembly, and certainly staff, for a just recap of how the project is going. That being said, you know, it's an active project in its nascent stages, which means that it's subject to change. And so I'm qualifying everything I say, because as I go through this memo, you know, I want to make sure that 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 I'm not saying anything that's for certain because of the stage we are in the project. So what stage are we in the project? We're at 35% design. And, you know, normally in a project, we'd have a pretty good idea of what that looks like. We do not in this project, just because of the unique nature of it. I mean, we're taking these very tall, I mean, they're much higher than our current towers out there, that were designed for profile in Austria, and putting them in our backyard. And they have to be able to safely carry 12 to 15 passengers. They're designed for 15, but I think, as Chair Satry likes to point out, unlikely that 15 Americans are going to fit in one of those cars. So we probably won't load them, sorry, Mike. So we probably won't load them that full, but it's also in a heavy wind environment. I mean, you've seen those trees on the top of Eagle Crest, right? They're just like bent over and they grow this way because of, so anyway, that is only in the winter, that's true, but but it has to be designed to operate year round. And there are operational things that we can do to mitigate that. So that's all that's all to say we're only at 35% design, and we don't have a really firm handle on budget. Our total project cost for this is 12.5 million. So that's the funds, the combination of funds that have been appropriated and the loan from Gold Belt. And we've really, CBJ Engineering and Eagle Crest has really taken the project down to what we call the backbone, right? The backbone infrastructure, which just is the gondola. So let's not design, you know, the bars and the ski lodges at the top yet. Gold Belt is confident they can sell that destination, you know, with a windbreak and some porta potties, because it really is a world-class destination. Now, as the gondola becomes revenue positive, there'll be more opportunities. So really trying to look at this project from a base level. So when I talk about how early we are in design and how the scope has really been reduced to that base scope, CBJ Engineering and the project team is confident that it can still be brought in on budget. But there's lots of qualifying statements to that, like the fact that we are only at 35% design, and that there's some major decisions that still need to be made before we know that. The other caveat to that, we're going to bring this in on budget statement, is there are things outside the gondola itself that may need to be cared for. Water and sewer capabilities at the lodge, the parking lot, an emergency vehicle, right? If you have to do an emergency evacuation, things like that that aren't all in all huge dollar items. And maybe some of them it's like, okay, well, we can make it through, you know, the first season because it's going to be a light season. So all of that is still up in the air. So that's my major all my qualifying statements to bring this project in on budget. When will we know? When will you guys be able to be like, let's vote on that? If you need to vote on that, we're hoping that you won't have to. And we really won't have a guaranteed maximum price until next spring. We'll know a lot more in September once we bring our GCCM contractor on. So part of the reason why we don't have the certainty is because we're not doing a traditional like low bid where we design it to 100%, we issue a bid, and whoever responds lowest gets it. And I'll say there's been a lot of uncertainty in that bidding climate too. We recently bid the Vector dump project out at the Juneau Douglas wastewater treatment plant, and it came in the bid came in twice what the cost estimate was, so we had to cancel that project. All that to say that, the traditional model of bidding projects doesn't guarantee you that your estimate is going to be accurate. I don't know if you want to.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Just a quick question. Madam Manager, do we know how many qualified companies are around that could actually perform this in Juneau, or did we anticipate that this bid would have to go out because we would need to have access to a larger contractor pool? Maybe just a couple quick words on that.
Yeah, so all of our bids are advertised broadly, right, and available to anyone. We would be breaking this project up into a couple stages. So a lot of it is just dirt work, right, because we have to build an access road. And so that work could be done by many of our contractors in this community that do road building. And that work we would hope to start hope to start this summer and then finish next summer. As far as erecting towers go, there are local companies that have erected the tram in, I know in Hoona. I'm sure there was I don't know the company that erected Gold Belt's tram, but I do know that we do have local contractors that have that experience. So we'll have a better idea from a timing perspective in September, but we won't have that guaranteed maximum price until mid-March. And so I was just explaining that the relationship is different on a project with the alternative procurement, right? You have this, you bring on the contractor early in design so that design decisions can be made with the contractor, all with an eye on a negotiated guaranteed maximum price. And so that makes the procurement method a little bit unique, and also our timing. We do think that it would be, if additional funds are needed, it would be a good argument for use of a loan from passenger fees. That's something we haven't, socialized or put on a list with CLIA or anything, but certainly there's a lot of defensibility for that funding source. So that is all about budget. Any budget questions? Okay. Timeline. So remember when I told you that this project is ever evolving and dynamic? The CBJ Engineering believes that we can have this, the wheels turning on this gondola by summer 2026. And he outlines, a project manager, Stefford, outlines a construction schedule in there that's aggressive, right? It's definitely aggressive and ambitious. But what Eagle Crest staff has pointed out is it's all well and good to turn a gondola by 2026, but you have to know that the gondola works. You have to work out the kinks. You have to have staff training. You have to have safety measures in place. You have to have, sold those tickets. You have to have done all of those things in advance, and a full season might not be more realistic until 2027. So I think there's still, can we do it? Can we have that piece of infrastructure up? Which is the question that, CBJ Engineering is like, yes, we can deliver that. Does that mean we can deliver a product, a reliable product by that time? I think that's a different story. And so that really will be answered by the independent analysis that CBJ, the Assembly appropriated $50,000 during the budget process for. So the intent is that we bring someone on who can really dig into the business plan, and in your wisdom, you appropriated those funds. And a lot of those questions will be able to be answered. So timeline is a moving target as budget is, but you kind of know what I know of this snapshot in time, and we'll come back to you with additional updates. Just to talk about a couple of other things, Eagle Crest, we still have a franchise agreement pending with Gold Belt, so that's something that you will see in the future. We also have some conversation about Hooter. If you remember, Mr. Scanlon presented a opportunity to do some summer operations and kind of test drive selling that product, bringing people up the Hooter chair and then having them walk down the access road. And there was legitimate concern expressed about, well, what kind of public outreach has this had? And that also will be part of the business plan that's developed and a public communication schedule. And I think there's some significant hurdles to that that just need to be, planned out. Like, can we market this to a very active group? Or, because it's, you guys have probably all walked down that hill. If you get a little bit of gravel, or if you don't have good shoes on, it's a little bit slippery. And, what is for us just a normal walk might not be a normal walk for our visitors. So just kind of keeping all of those things in mind. Another challenge will be heavy construction. So kind of organizing any summer tours around heavy construction. All that to say, if that is something that happens, we would need to do that public outreach, need to bring you along. And that's just another plan that's developing. There's certainly an advantage to developing some summer operations, and Eagle Crest currently serves 350 to 390 visitors each time a Viking Cruise Line calls. So they have like a nice little path and a little fire pit and a little charcuterie board, and that's been very successful. So they do have some touch.
Thank you, Madam Manager. Ms. Wall has a question.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. I am definitely curious, and maybe this is a question for me to bring back to the board as liaison, or maybe someone here can answer it. But, I know we talked about kind of Hooter and ramping up summer operations in 2025, earlier, but I kind of got the impression from since then that maybe that was no longer kind of in the board's plans. And I'm definitely curious if you have had recent conversation that suggests that's still of interest, or what kind of the timeline looks like for making that type of decision for next summer.
Madam Manager.
So my conversations with Eagle Crest have been, I think they've been struggling with the obstacles and the challenges. So they've gone back and forth as well, which is why you feel like we're being a little bit there's a word for so your sentiment is noted. The timeline that we've discussed most recently is a 2025 timeline. But like I mentioned, there's still so many obstacles. I think we just wanted to make sure that it was still on the table and still being explored, and that the Assembly knew that.
Thank you. Ms. Uskandis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just want to make sure you got the right context for the timeline. According to our agreement with Gold Belt for those funds, when did we say we would have the gondola spinning? Regardless, like not counting, we have to train people or you have to sell the tickets, but when did we say it would be operational?
It's my understanding summer operations in 2026, which would be operational in December of 2026.
Is what we agreed to.
And
that's what we think we're going to.
No, I see no.
I see a head shake and I see a head nod.
I'd be happy to review the agreement.
I just don't have it in front of me. I just thought you might know it off the top of your head.
Okay.
Yes, carry on, please.
Okay.
Excellent information so far.
So just, want to just note communications is important on this. And so we will know more this fall, and we plan on bringing you an update then. Plan on really engaging the Eagle Crest board more frequently than that. But I just want to really make this project transparent. And so sometimes sometimes that can be frustrating, right? Because you're like, well, you don't know the real answer. And that's kind of erring on the side of transparency. So thank you for your patience on that, and expect more communication from both Eagle Crest and CBJ Engineering, and by extension, the manager's office. I just wanted to touch briefly on other things Eagle Crest, so not related to the gondola. As you likely know, Eagle Crest has hired Kirk Duncan, former general manager and former public works director, and Parks and Recreation Director, to help advise on both the hiring of a manager, advise on how to make sure we can get Eagle Crest up and running for winter operations, do a lot of the assessment on infrastructure, and I think that's where a lot of these good conversations are happening from an operational perspective, because CBJ Engineering can build a gondola, like we can put that up, but Eagle Crest really needs to help with a million little operational decisions, and not just the gondola, but of course the core services of winter operations. So I just wanted to let you know that that is happening and that's going really well. In the budget, if you recall, you authorized a little over $500,000 loan to Eagle Crest to fund their base budget and a 6% wage increase for employees. And at that time, you also funded the $50,000 for the independent analysis. And at that time, you also said, let's fund this so that you guys can keep marching forward and do your thing, but let's revisit it at a later date, because the request was for an additional $300,000 from Eagle Crest. And so I just wanted to let you know that we are working with Eagle Crest staff and with Mr. Duncan on a revised budget to bring to the Finance Committee this fall. Mr. Duncan is I think that a lot of the budget is sound, but we need to bring you a full picture of not just the budget need at Eagle Crest, but the capital budget need too, and that full picture, so that you can kind of revisit that conversation as you indicated a desire to. So that is the conclusion of my memo, and it is informational only. Questions, welcome.
Are there further questions? Thank you very much, Madam Manager. That was great information. And for me, even being told I'm not sure what the answer is better than not being told. So thanks. Are there further questions? I'm seeing no further questions. And I want to thank everybody from Eagle Crest everybody who has thoughts and concerns about Eagle Crest for being here. I really appreciate your waiting. Next topic, Madam Manager. Grants pass.
I get to give this one to the Roberts.
And I believe, Mr. Barr, and I believe Ms. Lane also has an update for us. Is that correct?
She does.
Okay, great.
So maybe I'll start, and then we can go to Ms. Lane if that works for you, Madam Deputy Mayor.
That's great. That works really well.
So I'll start just by reiterating what Manager Kester said at the beginning of the meeting, which is just acknowledging that we had a tragic police shooting occur earlier today that has a through line to this topic. And I wanted to note that the Deputy Mayor, you, Madam Deputy Mayor, and I spoke and thought really hard about whether or not we should pull this agenda item, and that was a hard decision. I think it's probably fair to say we were both 50-50 on that. We obviously landed on keeping it. I think a big reason for that is, at least when I grapple with the public and community purpose of this agenda item and continuing to talk about it, I lean towards thinking that we are better served by continuing to struggle with this really particularly hard topic rather than not, for a variety of reasons. One, we have organizations, all of which in some way or another are partners with us in this work, who are paying attention and need your thinking and kind of moving the path forward on this discussion. Of course, the body decided at our last committee of the whole meeting to bring this back after the Supreme Court's decision on grants pass. So there's two memos in your packet on this topic, one from Ms. Lane, one from me. And maybe before diving into mine, we could start with Ms. Lane. I think she has a quick summary for us on the United States Supreme Court's decision on the grants pass case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barr. And yes, I really appreciate that introduction. it's a very tough subject at this time. It's been a really hard day for everyone. Ms. Lane, thank you so much for this memo, and can you give us an outline?
Yes, Madam Deputy Mayor. So this is going to be super fast. I've got my own little timer here for 2 minutes. But it probably won't take that long. I think as everyone knows, the whole Western United States has been operating under a Ninth Circuit decision, the Boise case, which essentially said you can't criminalize individuals that are sleeping in public, camping in public, sleeping in cars, if there's no place else for them to go. And as part of that, cities have been tasked with, making sure that they have a place to go before you do anything. And ultimately, a lot of the United States has really just put things on hold for now to try to see, what can be done. It's a tough subject. So the city of Grants Pass, Oregon, a town about the same size as Juneau, about 38,000 people with about a 600-person population of homeless individuals, ultimately outlawed sleeping in public, sleeping in all public places, and ultimately it was appealed. It made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, who finally issued its decision June 28th. And what they said was that this is a complex topic, and the communities know best what to do with their populations. And the Supreme Court said that they're not going to tell communities what they should do. What they did say was that Grants Pass, their ordinance was not cruel and unusual under the Eighth Amendment, which is how it had been challenged. And they indicated that for the most part, communities can enforce their camping, their, littering, their anything that had to do with sleeping in public, and that it is not cruel and unusual, and that they're not going to weigh in to the policy in each individual town across the nation. So 2 minutes, the end.
No, please carry on.
I'm kidding. So ultimately, it's tough because, and they also recognize that it's tough, and the decision is about, like 45 pages, and then there's like a dissent that's about as long because it is such a complicated decision. But ultimately, you are the policymakers, and you know this community better than anyone else, and better than the Supreme Court, definitely. So, with that, I think Mr. Barr has a little bit to say about this and what we have on the books right now, and some recommendations, and you have really tough decisions.
Thank you, Ms. Lane, and it was a great analysis and memo. Thank you. Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So we have legislation code on the books right now that has rules, that defines rules around camping in public places today. You can kind of think of those code sections as having lived in a gray zone for the past couple of years while the Ninth Circuit's ruling was the law of the land. But after the Supreme Court's ruling, that code that we have on the books is again applicable. And what that code does is it prohibits camping on a public right-of-way, and it permits camping on most really other public lands for periods of up to 48 hours. And it also prohibits camping, living inside of most vehicles, right, except when that's specifically allowed. I think it's also important to note that violations of this section of code, of both of those two sections of code that I just described, are, as they're defined right now, non-criminal infractions, so they're punishable by fines. In the recommendation section of my memo to you in the packet, I noted it as an information item for the reason that because that code already exists, right? So unless you decide to change that or ask us to bring back, modifications to that legislation, that code exists, and I've had a number of conversations with staff at JPD and CCFR and partner agencies, and we think we can use that code as it exists right now to address especially challenging sites and situations. We're definitely sensitive to the fact that we still have a larger population of people experiencing homelessness than we have shelter space available for those people. I think it's important to acknowledge that and to maintain awareness of that, and also to be sensitive to the fact that the low barrier shelter options that we have don't necessarily work for all of the people that are experiencing homelessness in our community. So that is to say, we are going to have camping of some sort happening. That's simply a fact based on the numbers. So we wouldn't use the code in place. We couldn't use the code in place to prohibit camping on public property everywhere. Even if we wanted to, we don't have the capacity for that. And what we would do under the code as it exists right now is selectively enforce on a criteria-driven basis, focusing only on those sites that present the most significant health and safety concerns that kind of rise to our attention and that exist in the community, while of course continuing when we take that enforcement action to do that in as caring a way as possible, while working to connect the people that we're engaging with in those situations with the best resources that are available in the community today. So that's what I've got, Madam Deputy Mayor, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Manager. Are there questions for Mr. Deputy Manager? Mr. Bryson and then Mr. Kelly. Oh, Ms. Atkinson, we'll go with you first since you're online, and then Mr. Bryson and and then Ms. Euskenis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have a question that's sort of related to this memo, but a little adjacent. I've heard from folks in the community that they attribute a lot of the issues we've had this year with the fact that the city doesn't have a designated campground for our homeless population. And I was just wondering, I know we're having trouble and we couldn't find a location this year. What can we do, or what maybe is city staff already doing to ensure that we're not in this position again next year?
Thank you, Ms. Atkinson. Mr. Deputy Manager.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So one thing that we've been working on right now is preparing for the winter, right? So we've been engaging again with St. Vincent de Paul on prepping for the cold weather shelter. We've been working on a construction project out at the site for the cold weather emergency shelter to improve sanitation and restrooms and potable water so that we don't have the same struggles that we did last winter season. We still don't have a good plan for the summer, and I think I have a hard time seeing a path forward on that. I still have conversations with partner agencies and regularly with CBJ staff and various staff groups across the organization, not just with police and fire. And I don't have a good answer for that summer question. It's still a big struggle.
Thank you. Next we have Mr. Bryson, and then Mr. Kelly. Did you have your hand? Okay, Mr. Kelly, Ms. Euskenis, and Ms. Wall. Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have two, but if I can't ask the second one, I won't. So, Mr. Barr, listening to your presentation, so that I'm correct, the first responders, so both police and fire, and then the vulnerable population service providers are in favor of the course of action that you have described for us tonight. Is that correct?
Mr. Deputy Manager.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Bryson. I guess I would say that every conversation that I have, every meeting that I have on this topic has a slightly different flavor to it. But I think it's fair to say that, in broad strokes, I would answer in the affirmative, yes.
Go ahead.
So you had mentioned that the Supreme Court ruling also touched on living in cars. Has that changed CBJ's ability to impound or tow or remove some of the derelict vehicles that have been abandoned in some of the side streets in the community?
Mr. Deputy Manager.
Thank you again for that question, Mr. Bryson, through the Deputy Mayor. When it comes to impounding and towing vehicles, our largest limiting, the critical path on that, the limiting factor is really capacity of the impound yard and of our ability to deal with vehicles in the impound yard, particularly vehicles that are associated with crimes that require safekeeping for evidentiary perspectives. That said, yes, the Supreme Court decision similar to camping in public places and returning that legislative control to really they return it to the states, but where the states don't take action, it defaults to municipalities, as Attorney Lane said. That same statement is true for impound vehicles as well, and for any legislation on that front. So the answer to your question is, the short answer to your question is yes, that control lives with the Assembly, where that control largely did not live with the Assembly prior to the Supreme Court ruling for lived-in vehicles. But there's a lot of complexity there.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could expound on something you said in your report. You mentioned that in enforcing some of these items that have been in our code that we're now empowered to enforce, that we're selectively doing so when a health and safety situation occurs. Would you be able to expound on what, or would that maybe be would you be able to expound on what sort of situation would be covered under health and safety? What do you mean by that?
Mr. Deputy Manager.
Sure. When we look at situations and think about health and safety impacts, we would be looking at everything from, excessive amounts of human waste and garbage to, needles, to evidence of criminal activity. We'd be paying close attention to reports that have been made to JBD from the community around the site. We'd be paying attention to, the numbers from a variety of perspectives.
Thank you. Ms. Euskandis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my question is just, I want to make sure I understand clearly. So based on this decision, our direction to staff, or not our direction, but the manager's office direction, has anything changed at all since this decision in the way that things are being enforced? Has any actual action from a CBJ employee changed?
Mr. Deputy Manager.
No, not before this meeting.
Did you say not before this
You want
meeting?
to clarify that last comment?
Yeah, no. The answer to your question is no. We wanted to bring this topic to the body tonight so that code is on the books, that exists, right? And I wanted to bring this information, both the decision of the grants pass case as well as my memo that describes the existing code that has kind of lived in that limbo area before we start utilizing that code again.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure I was crystal on that.
Thank you. Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. I had a different question, but now I want to follow up on that. But I guess my assumption from your comment is, and from reading this, is that it will change moving forward without any policy change direction from the Assembly.
That's correct.
Okay. You mentioned our, citywide code. You don't mention our code specifically around downtown camping. And I was not on the Assembly at the time that was passed. I remember it vaguely because I know it was a close vote and very controversial. You know, my understanding is at the time, you know, there was an opinion from staff and from legal that, you know, what was passed wouldn't be enforceable. And so can you speak to what changes downtown with the results of this decision?
Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I might seek a lifeline from Mr. Palmer on this one, but I will take a quick stab at it. And my understanding is that the downtown camping pieces of the code are relatively limited, maybe even exclusively limited to private property camping. And so I don't believe that anything changes, but I might seek confirmation from him.
Mr. Attorney.
Mr. Barr also gets an honorary law degree tonight. So, to your question, Ms. Wall, there was significant public interest in this topic. During the Assembly debate, that's when the original Boise case came out. And it could have been right before or right after the Assembly adopted the camping ordinance. I don't recall that specific detail off the cuff right now. But I do recall shortly having a meeting actually out in Wedding Cake Park in Marine Park with the police chief, trying to figure out how to apply that new ordinance in the concept of the Boise case. And the reason why we had that discussion was, as Deputy Manager Barr acutely described, the ordinance that the Assembly passed only prohibited camping on private property in downtown. The consequence of that ordinance, and there was significant public interest and publication on this, meant that people could then sleep in public places. And in order for the city to take enforcement action in those public places, we had to then comply with the Boise decision, which meant that we had to go seek some sort of confirmation that there was space available in a shelter before we could take enforcement action. And so that decision was a little bit nuanced, and now because of the Grants Pass decision, we don't have to take those steps. And so the downtown ordinance is still enforceable. We now don't have that requirement on the public property if somebody is there.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. We discussed last committee of the whole this kind of exclusionary zone or whatever around the Glory Hall and Teal Street Center. I still remain concerned about the ability of those organizations to provide a safe place for their employees and worry about the recruitment and retention issues that may result, and also about the ability for people in those facilities to receive necessary services due to the behaviors of others. Does this case impact, does it open up or allow us to use existing tools? Do you feel like that the outcome of this case and this ruling will allow JPD or others to use enforcement tools to hopefully improve that situation there?
Mr. Deputy Manager.
Thank you. Through the Deputy Mayor. Yes, I do. I think that the code on the books allows us to take what enforcement action might be necessary. It is possible. You know, the concept of the shelter safety zone that was presented at the last committee of the whole meeting that Bellingham has code on the books for, it is possible to go down that path as well. You know, our current code and that code is not exclusionary of each other, but I think the code that we have on the books is at minimum a good first step, and maybe more than that.
I'll go ahead and ask a question. It's my understanding from conversations that we've had, and I think from separate conversations with you that, and I think you just said so tonight too, that we don't have the resources to be, you know, moving people away from camping places. It's really everywhere. It's really, as I understand it, the focus is you develop your criteria, and there's lots of public areas where people might be camping, that if there's not a health and safety problem, where if they're not next to a Head Start facility, things like that, that they won't be, they shouldn't expect that they'd be, have somebody come and ask them to move. Is that kind of what I'm understanding correctly?
Yes.
Thank you. Are there further questions or comments from the body? Ms. Wall and Ms. Huskandis.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Just a quick comment. Really appreciate this discussion, and I'm okay, not seeking an alternative policy direction at this time, but I would love, I appreciate the way, Mr. Barr, you talk about the intent of how this will be enforced, but I think, intent can look differently on the ground, and if there's a way that we can develop some, I don't know, for lack of a better term, metrics or data or something that can help this body monitor how that's going and make sure the way that this is being enforced is, matching our values. And I don't want to make something complicated, but we don't see necessarily how this plays out, and it would be nice to have a little bit better pulse on what has changed than just words. So maybe something we can work on with our departments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wall. Ms. Huskandis and then Mr. Kelly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a few comments. I think this obviously is a sort of impossible problem and is nationwide, and is a spectacular failure by the federal government and a spectacular failure by the state. And so for the Supreme Court to say, you're local and you know best, it does not change my mind about whether it is humane or at all justifiable to criminalize the act of existing when there are not shelter beds and someone is unsheltered. So I would be extremely wary of any, as just far as a temperature check, that's my own temperature, of doing anything that is a drastic, or really not drastic, but if we start to do differently than we have because of the court case, I appreciate you bringing this to us and us having this conversation. But Ms. Wall said something about, I don't know, reflects our values or kind of the sense of the assembly. And just because of this court case passing, I still think we're living where we have an unsheltered population that's larger than we have the ability to help or the resources to help. So I wouldn't want us to, like I said, criminalize their existence. And then just to speak a little bit to our summer camp and lack thereof, the dispersed camping versus, I know there was a lot of problems when we provided a focused area for that. And I, believe you me, I am not thrilled about the idea of, I know that we do not have endless resources, but I think this is something for the assembly, the same way that we have done more and more for the school district because the state is not. This is something that we are going to have to address. I don't see it going away, and so I don't have a solution or much more than that for tonight, but just I do think that this is a major problem, and just doing nothing is probably not going to be acceptable as time goes on. Our community, we're hearing more from the community, and I think we want to keep that balance, but we may, whether we like it or not, have to consider that our partners in this may need more.
Thank you, Ms. Huskandis. Mr. Kelly, and then Mr. Bryson.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I just wanted to throw my weight behind everything that Ms. Wall just said.
Thank you. Mr. Bryson.
Madam Deputy Mayor, so I want to thank Ms. Huskandis because she just couldn't give me a better segue. Right now, our homeless crisis is in a worse position than what we were last year, and it's worse than it was the year before. And it's kind of hard to compare when we were in the pandemic because that was like a whole different set of problems. But let's go back to 2019. Our homeless situation is worse than it was in 2019. The course of action that we have been on has not been effective and has only made the situation, I don't want to say worse, but the situation is not as good as what it was previously. So we're in a worse predicament now with the number of people and the different problems that have come. I don't want to get too much into societal. The point that I'd like to make about tonight, and this is where I feel like I'm kind of continuing on with Ms. Huskandy, is because we want to come up with an effective solution that helps the service providers. We're already doing it better than anybody else. We want to keep on that path. This change with this court ruling, this is the beginning of the change that we don't even know is coming yet. The community has been begging for change. We've been trying to figure out the change. And I promise all the homeless people out there, I'd be willing to bet that they're all asking for a change as well. With this court ruling, that's the change we were waiting for. We now have ability to make a difference and say, this is how we're going to handle it. Juneau has already been doing homelessness services better than any other city in the state. We have an opportunity to continue to do the best things that this state has seen. I have faith in our city leadership and in our service providers. And and thank you to Ms. Wohl. Mr. Barr, would you be kind enough to bring back the information like what the criteria is, so that way you're exactly right. Let's make sure that the criteria that is being used matches the values that this assembly shares. But I truly believe we're at the beginning of that crux of change that the community and the industry has been begging for. I would strongly urge that we let city staff do what they need to do and then come back with us and let us know how well things are working. Thank you for the time, Madam Mayor, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. I just want to express my appreciation, Mr. Deputy Manager, to you and to JPD for the really the careful handling of the care that you put into making the decisions about how and when to work with someone. I've seen JPD officers working with people, and I know that you put a lot of thought into this. So I just want to thank you for the care with which you presented this tonight and the ongoing care. Thanks. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I think it's been brought up a couple of times, but I just maybe I'm going to say it a little more forward. Can you come back to us in an appropriate amount of time, 2 months or something, for a verbal update, just to let us know how city staff and whatever is operating under this new ruling, and also I would just add for personally, including efforts at the around the Glory Hall and Teal Street Center. Is that something you can do for us?
Mr. Barr.
At the will of the chair.
Yes, I am sure we can have an update.
Very good.
Thank you.
Short, verbal, whatever.
Yep,
But
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. And I think we're good with this conversation then. Thank you, Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Manager. Madam Manager, we have one last item, which is an informational item.
Thank you. This is very brief. It's mostly just an FYI. We've been doing some moving around here with CBJ downtown staff to be able to vacate the Muni Way building. So you're going to notice that Human Resources has moved into City Hall, which is great because now new hires and the like can come into this fabulously updated climate controlled building. And that is thanks to IT, some of the IT staff working remote. So that's our short-term plan. Our kind of midterm plan, which I consider a 12-month plan, is to relocate IT and some finance at Marie Drake. So we are moving forward with putting staff in the upstairs classrooms that reserves downstairs space for community use. So just wanted to let you know that all those changes are afoot. Long-term, of course, still in negotiations with the Burns Building. Hope to bring you a update on that at your next committee, the whole meeting. And the other public service announcement of that is we are spending money on new furniture for employees at Marie Drake, and hoping that, not hoping, and working very hard to make sure, I'm pointing at Robert because he's the taskmaster on that, to make sure that anything that we purchase would be usable in a new space. So just wanted to let you all know that was happening. It's kind of more germane to you guys, but that's happening.
Thank you, Madam Manager. I see no questions, so our next meeting date is August 5th, 2024, and we are adjourned at 8:47 PM.